She arrived at my door wounded, fleeing her fiancé. What she didn't know was that he would come looking for her. Blood had already stained the porch wood by the time she fell to her knees, her hand clamped to her side, knuckles white from the pressure on her wound. The prairie wind tore strands of loose hair from her head and whipped them across her face, mingling with the cold sweat running down her forehead. Behind her, in the distance, the sound of hooves on dry earth could still be heard, growing fainter. She didn't look back. She knocked 3 times with a closed fist, and when the door opened, the only thing she could manage before her legs gave out was a single word. Help me. Thomas Calder caught her before her body hit the ground. He didn't know her. He had never seen her in his life, and yet, in that instant, something in him decided, without asking reason's permission, that this woman would never be alone again as long as he had breath in his body. Thomas's farm stood at the edge, where Millbrook Hollow Valley ceased to be cultivated land and began to turn into scrubland and unnamed hills. It was a modest property, the kind sustained by one man's hands and the stubbornness not to give up. Thomas was 34, his hands calloused from having plowed more land than he would ever rest on, and a solitude that had taken up residence in his chest for so long he barely recognized it as such anymore. He had buried his wife 6 years ago, during the winter when fever took half the county, and since then he had learned to speak only to animals and tools, because they were the only ones who didn't return his silence with pity. He had no plans to change anything. He woke before dawn, worked until the sun set, and ate dinner alone in front of a window that overlooked the empty road. That's how it had been for 6 years. That's how, he thought, it would continue to be. Until that night. He carried her inside the house, laid her on the only bed in the main room, and lit the oil lamp with hands that, to his own surprise, trembled. The wound wasn't deep, a clean cut on her side, likely from a knife or the edge of a spur, but it had bled a lot, and the woman was as pale as wax. Thomas boiled water, tore one of his own shirts for bandages, and cleaned the wound with the care of someone who fears breaking something already broken. She woke at dawn, her eyes, a color between hazel and gray depending on the light, opened first with fear, and then, seeing where she was, with a cautious distrust that Thomas recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who has learned not to trust the kindness of strangers. "You're safe," he said, keeping his distance, his hands visible. "No one will touch you here." Her name was Eleanor Whitfield, though it took her 3 days to tell him her full name. For those 3 days, she barely spoke. She ate what he left her on a tray by the door, slept with a kitchen knife hidden under her pillow. Thomas knew because he saw it one morning when changing the sheets, and he said nothing. Because he understood that knife was the only thing that made her feel secure, and watched the road through the window as if expecting at any moment to see something that terrified her appear. What she didn't tell, and what Thomas also didn't ask, because some silences must be earned, not demanded, was that she had been promised since she was 17 to a man named Harlan Voss, owner of the most extensive lands in 3 counties, a man who collected properties and people with the same cold calculation. The engagement hadn't been a choice. It had been her father's debt, paid with his daughter's body and future. And the night Eleanor finally understood that this marriage would not be a life, but a sentence, she ran. She ran without a map, without money, with no more possession than the dress she wore, and a determination that burned in her chest more than fear. Harlan was not one to let go of what he considered his. Eleanor knew that. What Thomas didn't know was that the same determination that had made her run was the same that, slowly, without either of them planning it, would begin to weave something between them that no fiancé or man with land could ever buy. Weeks passed, and Eleanor's convalescence became something more than simply recovering from a wounded body. Thomas showed her how to milk the only cow he had left, not because she asked him to, but because he noticed Eleanor's hands needed something to do, something to keep them occupied and away from memories. She, in turn, without him asking either, began to mend Thomas's work clothes, which had been worn for years with the same holes because he had never learned to sew and had never wanted to learn. "You don't have to do that," he told her one afternoon, finding her sitting by the window with his oldest shirt in her hands, the needle moving with silent precision. "I know," she replied, without looking up. "But you saved my life without asking for anything in return. This is the only thing I have to give back." Thomas didn't know what to say to that. He stood on the threshold a moment longer, looking at her, and then left before she could notice that something in his chest had shifted. The dinners began to change. At first, Eleanor ate in her room, alone, out of habit or fear. But one night, without anyone planning it, she appeared in the kitchen just as Thomas was serving 2 plates instead of 1, as if her body had decided before her mind that she was no longer a stranger to be treated with distance. They sat at the same table. They didn't talk about Harlan, or the engagement, or the wound. They talked about the weather, the harvest, about a dog Thomas had as a child. Small things. Things that, said between 2 people who are beginning to trust, weigh more than they appear. Eleanor started leaving him fresh coffee each morning, ready before he came down, even though she herself barely slept due to nightmares. Thomas, without saying anything, began to repair the fence of the corral closest to her room window, so she could see the sunset without broken planks blocking her view. Neither of them mentioned why they did what they did, but both of them noticed. But what neither of them knew yet was that 3 counties away, Harlan Voss had already begun to search. October arrived with the dry cold of the prairie, and with it the first rumors. A traveler who passed through Millbrook Hollow mentioned, almost in passing at the general store, that a rich man from the eastern lands was offering a considerable reward for information about a young woman, brown hair, hazel eyes, missing since late August. The store owner, a man named Walter Briggs, who had known Thomas since he was a child, told him that same afternoon, while selling him nails and tobacco, in a low voice of someone who knows they are delivering something heavier than information. Thomas said nothing, but that night, as they ate dinner, he looked at Eleanor differently, and she, who had spent weeks learning to read his silences, knew immediately that he knew. "How long have you known?" she asked, placing her fork on the table. "Since this afternoon." "And what do you plan to do?" Thomas hesitated before answering. When he did, his voice was low but firm, the kind of voice that doesn't need to be raised to be believed. "Nothing, unless you want me to do something." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been clenched like a fist for 2 months. That night, she told him everything. The forced engagement, her father's debt, the 6 years she spent learning to smile in front of Harlan while fading inside. The night she decided she would rather die running than live locked away. Thomas listened without interrupting, his hands still on the table, his jaw tightening every time she described something that ignited a rage in him he didn't know he was still capable of feeling. When she finished, he simply said, "While you are in this house, no one will force you to do anything." But the promise of a single man on a farm with no more defense than an old shotgun against the fortune and determination of Harlan Voss was a fragile promise, and they both knew it. The pressure came 2 weeks later in the form of 2 men on horseback who appeared at the boundary of Thomas's property, sent by Harlan with the excuse of verifying information about a missing woman. Thomas met them at the door, his body blocking the entrance, his voice calm but unyielding. "There is no missing woman here, only my cousin who came to spend the winter." The men didn't believe him. It was evident in their looks, but they had no proof, and they left with the veiled warning that Mr. Voss doesn't give up easily on what he considers his. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, staring into the darkness, and when Thomas found her there, hugging her knees, he knew the fear had returned with renewed force. "I have to go," she said without looking at him. "If I stay, this will only bring you trouble. Voss won't stop, and you don't deserve to pay for something that is mine." "And where would you go?" he asked, sitting in front of her without touching her, respecting the distance she herself needed. Eleanor had no answer, because the truth was, there was nowhere to go. The entire world for her had shrunk to that valley, that farm, that man who had taken her in bleeding from his own doorstep and who, without asking for anything, had given her back something she thought lost forever. The feeling that her life belonged to her. It was in that silence, in that unanswered question, that something began to change irreversibly. Because they both understood, without saying it yet, that the question was no longer whether she should stay for safety or necessity. The question was whether he was willing to fight for her to stay, and whether she was willing to stop running, and for the first time in her life, choose to stay for herself. Psychologists have studied for decades what happens when a person leaves a prolonged, controlling relationship. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, in his research on trauma and the body, described how relational safety, not the absence of danger, but the constant presence of someone trustworthy, is the only thing capable of rewriting, slowly, what fear had etched into a person's nervous system. November brought the first frost, and with it, the moment Thomas had been postponing for weeks without realizing he was postponing it. Eleanor was in the corral, adjusting a blanket over the back of the farm's oldest horse, when he approached from behind, hands in his pockets, and a nervousness he hadn't felt since the days he courted his late wife. "Eleanor." She turned. Something in the way he said her name, not ma'am, not you, but simply her name, bare and direct, told her that this conversation would be different from all the others. "When you arrived at my door," he began, searching for words with the honest clumsiness of a man unaccustomed to speaking of what he feels, "I thought my only obligation was to heal your wound and let you go on your way when you were ready. That's what I told myself for weeks." "And now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "Now, I don't know how I'm going to live in this house if you leave." The silence that followed was not empty. It was one of those silences that weigh more than any word, where two people look at each other and understand, without need for confirmation, that something mutual and true has been growing beneath the surface of the everyday. "I'm afraid," she admitted finally. Not of you, of wanting something again, of believing again that I can choose my own life and that choice won't be snatched away from me. I can't promise you that Voss won't try again, Thomas said, taking another step closer. But I can promise you that as long as I have breath, you will never face him alone again. Eleanor felt something break inside her, not from pain, but from relief, like a dam finally giving way to a current it had held back for too long. She took the last step separating them, and for the first time since she had arrived at that house, she was the one who made the decision. She rested her forehead against Thomas's chest, and he wrapped his arms around her without saying anything more, because some truths need no more words than shared silence. Before we continue, and here, only here, a pause to ask you, who are listening to this story. From what country are you accompanying us today? The final confrontation with Harlan Voss came in mid-December, when he himself, tired of sending intermediaries, showed up at the farm with 3 armed men and the cold arrogance of someone who has never had to face a no in his entire life. Thomas went out to meet him alone, his shotgun visibly propped against the doorframe, not as a threat, but as a clear boundary. She is not property to be claimed, Voss, Thomas said, his voice firm even though his heart was beating strongly. She is a person, and she has already chosen. Harlan glanced toward the window where Eleanor was watching, standing, not hiding for the first time in months. Is that true? He asked, addressing her directly. You choose this? A farm? A man without name? Without fortune? Eleanor came out onto the porch, stood beside Thomas, and her answer was as simple as it was definitive. I choose someone who never asked me for anything in return for saving me. That is worth more than all the land you possess. Harlan stood for a moment looking at them, calculating, and finally, realizing that pursuing any further would only bring him legal trouble and the public shame of pursuing a woman who clearly didn't want him, he mounted his horse and left. Without a word, without promises to return. And he never did. The following spring, Thomas and Eleanor were married on the same porch where she had knocked bleeding months ago, now decorated with wildflowers she herself had cultivated during the winter, as if she needed to prove to herself that something good could also grow from her own hand. The farm, once silent, began to fill with new sounds. Eleanor's laughter in the mornings, the sound of 2 plates clinking softly as they washed them together, the creak of the rocking chair Thomas built for the porch, where they sat every evening to watch the sunset over the hills of Millbrook Hollow. They built a life made of small gestures. He learned to care for the flowers she planted because he saw her happy doing it. She learned to bring him coffee to the fields during harvest afternoons, not because he asked her to, but because she had learned that those small acts were, for both of them, the most honest way of saying, I choose you, again, every day. 20 years later, on an autumn afternoon, a woman with graying hair sat on that same porch, now widened to make room for the grandchildren scampering in the yard. Thomas, his hair completely white and his hands still calloused, but slower, sat beside her as he had done every evening for 2 decades, and took her hand with the same certainty of the first night. Do you regret anything? He asked, as he sometimes did, almost as a joke. Eleanor looked at the horizon, where the sun was slowly sinking between the same colors of that first afternoon she woke up wounded in a strange bed, and answered what she always answered. Nothing, because that night I didn't find refuge. I found my home. And perhaps that, in the end, is the simplest truth about love. It doesn't always arrive as a clear destiny, nor as a promise spoken in time. Sometimes it arrives wounded, knocking on a door in the darkness, not yet knowing that on the other side awaits, finally, a place to belong.